Welcome to the second part of the sentence structure presentation. In this sentence structure presentation, we are going to learn about complex sentence structures. If you haven't done so already, please open your workbook to page 33, as you will need to complete the activities and notes as we go along. So, dependent clauses. So far we've learnt about independent clauses, a clause that can stand on its own, and it can make up a simple sentence and a compound sentence. Now, a dependent clause also contains a process and any participants and circumstances related to that process, but the clause cannot stand independently. That means it does not make sense on its own, and we need more information for it to be a complete thought. The reason why it becomes a dependent clause is because we use a subordinating conjunction. And these are conjunctions that make the clause dependent because they indicate that extra information will be needed to make it a complete thought. Here are some examples of subordinating conjunctions: because, since, when, while, until, if, as, though, although, unless, after, before, once, and whether, and they are just some examples. This will make more sense when you see it applied to a sentence. So, subordinating conjunctions provide a transition between two ideas in a sentence. They might show time, place, cause, and effect. And what they do is they reduce the importance of one clause and they make the other clause more important, so that the reader understands what the most important idea is. So here are some examples, and we have to circle the subordinating conjunction. Make sure you go through and do that now. Okay, so here are the answers. Louisa will wash the sink full of her dirty dishes once her roommate Shane cleans his stubble and globs of shaving cream from the bathroom sink. Now, we can't just have the idea, once her roommate Shane cleans the stubble and globs of shaving cream from the bathroom sink, and leave that as a sentence. It doesn't make sense. We're thinking, once what? What will happen? And then the rest of the idea is, once Louisa will wash the sink full of her dirty dishes, then he'll clean his globs of shaving cream off the bathroom sink. It's a really interesting thing about dependent clauses is that you can have them at the beginning of the sentence or the end of the sentence, and we're going to learn about how to punctuate them later. So here we have the word because. We looked on top of the refrigerator because Jenny will often hide a bag of chocolate chip cookies there. As her teeth were chattering in fear, Lydia clenched her jaw muscle while waiting for her turn to audition. Ronnie begins to sneeze violently whenever he opens the door to greet a fresh spring day. Now, in all of these examples, we can't just have the dependent clause on their own. It doesn't make sense. So, because Jenny will often hide a bag of chocolate chip cookies there, that doesn't make sense on its own. We're wanting to know what extra information is missing. As her teeth were chattering in fear, then we want to know what else is happening. And that's sometimes where you guys make a mistake. You put this as a sentence on its own and you put a full stop. And that's what we call a fragment. It's not. So, a complex sentence is a sentence that's made up of a dependent and an independent clause. What I would like you to do here is underline the independent clause and circle the dependent clause. And it will be really easy because the dependent clause will be the one that starts with the subordinating conjunction. So off you go and do that now. All right, so the dependent clause in number 1 was, as it is loosely based on the classic novel of the same title, And then the independent clause, is War of the Worlds stars Tom Cruise, Dakota Fanning, Justin Chatwin, Miranda Otto, and Tim Robbins. So as you can see in this example, the part underlined in pink stands on its own. It can be a sentence on its own, but the dependent clause does not. Okay, number 2, an American dock worker struggles to protect his children is an independent clause. It makes sense on its own. But the next part, which starts with the subordinating conjunction when, does not make sense on its own, and so it's the dependent clause. And number 3, again, it also starts with when. When War of the Worlds was released, okay, that doesn't make sense on its own. We need the extra information. And the independent clause, therefore, is it was the highest grossing film. Alright, now your task is to write 3 complex sentences of your own in the space provided in your booklet. I wonder how you went with that. Now, we can have something called a compound complex sentence. And this is made up of 2 independent clauses, just like a compound sentence, but it can also have 1 or more dependent clauses in it as well. Now, this is where your sentence structure starts to become quite complicated, and you need to know exactly what kinds of clauses you have and how you're using them to make sure that your sentence is correct. So here's an example. Because I wanted to see Guardians of the Galaxy, so we have a dependent clause right at the beginning because it starts with a subordinating conjunction. We know it's a clause because it has a process and any of the related participants and circumstances. So because I wanted to see Guardians of the Galaxy, my father took me and then we went to the restaurant near the theatre. So we have my father took me, independent clause, coordinating conjunction, then we went to the restaurant near the theatre, another independent clause. So dependent clause, independent clause, and independent clause. So that's a compound complex sentence. Although the movie was great, dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction. Alright, task 4. You need to identify the following sentences either simple, compound, complex, or compound complex sentences. Now, in all of these examples, the easiest way to identify what kind of clause it is to first find the processes. Because remember, a clause can only have one process. So if there's more than one process in the sentence, then it must be another type of sentence, either complex, compound, or compound complex. Don't get tricked up with helping verbs though. So you can have verb groups, but if you have 2 separate verbs in 2 separate parts of the sentence, then you have a different type of sentence. And then once you work that out, start looking for those hints, like subordinating conjunctions or coordinating conjunctions to help you out. Good luck. Okay, so the first one is a simple sentence because it only has one process, was. Herbert George Wells was a prolific writer of scientific romances. Now that's what we call a relating process. So as soon as you see any of those words like was, as, is, were, you know that you've got a clause on your hands. As the stories use science and fantasy, so dependent clause at the beginning, as, they created incredible scenarios and they also presented a type of social commentary. So 2 independent clauses and a dependent clause makes up a compound complex sentence. His best known works include The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, and The First Man in the Moon. That's actually a simple sentence. So simple sentences aren't always short sentences. They just have one process. Wells' famous works are widely read and have provided inspiration for many modern storytellers. This is a compound sentence. 2 sentences joined together by and. We have ellipsed the referring word though, and they have, which is referring back to his famous works. And we start to do that when our writing's a bit more sophisticated, because the reader knows that we're talking about his famous works. But it's still a compound sentence. We still know it's there in our mind. In the following passage from the novel, the narrator describes the arrival of the Martians. Now, this is a simple sentence. I put this one in as a little bit of a tricky one because I didn't want you to think just because we have something at the beginning of the sentence with a comma that it's always a dependent clause. This is actually a prepositional phrase in the following passage from the novel. So it's a simple sentence. While my eyes were fixed upon the cylinder, I half turned and began pushing my way back from the edge of the pit. Now that's a compound complex sentence. Dependent clause, then independent clause, and another independent clause. Again, the subject has been ellipsed, the I, because we know who he's talking about. I hope you did well with that. Some of those can be a little bit tricky. All right, now punctuating lead dependent clauses. This is a really important bit of punctuation, and it's something you are all getting wrong. Anyone who had this in their short story that you wrote for me had the dependent clause not punctuated correctly. So when a dependent clause is located after the independent clause, you do not need to put a comma between the two. So let's have a look at that example. An American dock worker struggles to protect his children when extraterrestrials invade the earth and devastate cities with towering war machines. Now here, the dependent clause, when, and so on, comes after the independent clause, so we don't put a comma. But you can put the dependent clause in theme position in your sentence. That means you put it first. And when you do that, you must separate it from the rest of the sentence with a comma. When extraterrestrials invade the earth and devastate cities with towering war machines, an American dock worker struggles to protect his children. Okay, so make sure when you put it first, you put a comma. And there's lots of reasons why you want to put the dependent clause first. To emphasize the point, because whatever you put in theme position becomes the most important idea. To link to a previous idea in the sentence before that, or to vary the flow of your writing, so it changes how your ideas flow from one to another and the pace and rhythm of your story. So task 5, could you please go through and add commas to those? So remember, if the dependent clause is first, you must separate it from the rest of the sentence with a comma. Okay, let's see how it went. So, we have 2 with the dependent clause first. After escaping the Martians, comma, the narrator meets a priest. Here, the dependent clause is second, even though the narrator starts to be bothered. So we don't need a comma. Because they didn't realise, again, it comes second, so we don't need a comma. So they all evacuate, we don't need a comma. But here we have it first. While their boat was shipping out, the Martians attacked, so we need the comma to separate the independent clause because it's first. Okay, I think that brings us to the end